So what does it mean going forward? Joining me from Washington are Brittany Cunningham. She's activist and co-host of the Pod Save the People podcast, and Mehdi Hasan, who's columnist at The Intercept. Thank you both for joining us. I want to ask you, Brittany, what you thought of the general tone. And I guess I'm asking you because there was a lot of talk about the inequality, the haves, the have-nots. And we've just come off that discussion with Charles Barkley talking about, so many, particularly black athletes and kids in college, having to fight whatever way they can, scholarships or whatever, to get a decent education. What do you think, and were you satisfied by what any of the candidates said in terms of education or closing the wealth and income inequality gap?
Well, I think what last night was a start to that conversation, but it most certainly wasn't broad enough. I think that Senator Booker, was the only person to actually mention the sin of poverty. And there was a lot of talk about the middle class, rebuilding it and reestablishing it, and that's a necessary conversation. But until we get serious about ensuring that there is a line that no one falls beneath, that is both a moral necessity and an economic necessity, until we take that seriously, the conversation is not broad enough. We also saw Senator Warren be very careful to make the distinction, not only to her opponents, but to the American people, about the difference between wealth inequality and income inequality. And it's an important distinction. Too often we hear journalists and candidates alike use those as interchangeable terms, and they're not. Income is about wages. Wealth is about what you possess after you pay all of your bills and your ability to withstand the obstacles that life throws your way. We see all the time that income inequality is actually less than wealth inequality is. That's why it can be true that a white high school dropout can have more wealth than a Black or Latinx college graduate. So I think that this conversation needs to continue, and we need to make sure that it's happening broadly enough to include things like housing, education, and a living wage in the larger solution to close the wealth gap.
I'm going to come back to some more domestic issues in a moment, but because we also talk about foreign policy, we see what President Trump is doing today. Mehdi Hasan, I mean, literally going back and forth like a pendulum in his response to what's happening in Syria and his green light to Turkey, and now with the allies, the Kurds, on the back foot. I wonder what you thought of how that issue was tackled in the debate last night, and foreign policy in general. I want to play a soundbite from the debate for you, because you had two of the candidates, Tulsi Gabbard, who was against American intervention, Pete Buttigieg, also a veteran, who was slightly more nuanced about the power of American forces in the world. Here's what he said.
A small number of special operations forces and intelligence capabilities were the only thing that stood between that part of Syria and what we're seeing now, which is the beginning of a genocide and the resurgence of ISIS. Meanwhile, soldiers in the field are reporting that for the first time they feel ashamed of what their country has done.
This, Mehdi, and even Brittany, may sound like foreign policy, but it's actually very, very important to American domestic and security policy. How do you think these issues were handled by the Democrats, Mehdi, who are vying to be the next president, and who will have this on their plate, whether they like it or not?
Thanks, Christiane. I'm so glad that they were able to have at least some discussion of Syria. These presidential debates, as you know, tend to gloss over foreign policy because the networks think the viewers are not interested. The irony is that anyone who becomes president of the United States has far more freedom abroad than they do at home, and often presidents are defined by their foreign policy legacy. Think of people like Ronald Reagan, even Barack Obama with the Iran deal. So I'm glad that they were able to discuss one aspect of foreign policy, Syria. You saw Pete Buttigieg there talking about the shame that Trump's decision has brought on America. The problem is, of course, is that Donald Trump is so extreme and out there on this issue of the Kurds and Syria. He's united his own party for once with the Democrats against him. Is that it was easy for all of the presidential candidates, all 12 of them, ridiculously 12 of them on stage, to come out and slam Trump and support the Kurds. Even Tulsi Gabbard, who's been a massive critic of American involvement in Syria, said that he betrayed the Kurds. What that does is it doesn't allow for a more meaningful debate about, well, what do you do about Syria? What do you do about the Middle East as a whole? What do you do about your alliance with Saudi Arabia or with Israel and the whole failure to get a two-state solution there? What do you do about the rise of China? So many issues still unexplored. And the irony is Bernie Sanders, in 2016, he was the radical on domestic policy. much of the Democrats have moved left on domestic policy, economic policy since then. And now he's the one candidate who's actually quite radical on foreign policy, but we didn't really get into it. For example, he's the one candidate, Christiane, who says he will use US aid as leverage over Israel. No other presidential candidate in my lifetime has ever said that. He did, though, go after Joe Biden on Iraq towards the end of the debate, and I'm glad he did, because Joe Biden had the nerve to say that the American decision on Syria was the most shameful foreign policy decision of his lifetime. No, it wasn't, Joe. Invading Iraq was, and Joe Biden supported that.
And and even in his own administration, when he was vice president, one of the most shameful actions was not crossing the red line when his president laid down that red line. I want to ask you, Brittany, about, I guess, the fact that Elizabeth Warren seems to be surging. Her position is that American forces should be out of the Middle East. But in general, she's very progressive on obviously so many of the domestic issues. And she was, I guess everybody was lining up to try to take her down this time. Last time it was lining up against Biden, this time against Warren. How did you find the tone, and did she take any major hits?
I think this is fascinating because to watch Elizabeth Warren surge, we have to recognize that it has happened without any really significant debate moments, that it's been a steady climb versus kind of a highlight versus a low light. So we've seen her steadily climb irrespective of a particular performance in a particular debate. And so I think that it's not just the fact that she's polling so well, but that she's doing so well consistently and that there's a steady rise that is making some other folks nervous. So we know that when you get on that debate stage, that part of the strategy is to go after the front runner. And now that there are multiple front runners, they had to share the load there, and they had to make sure that if Joe Biden took some hits last time, that Elizabeth Warren got some confrontation this time. I don't think that she particularly suffered. I think that she really held her own, especially toward the end. I think that there were some really challenging moments for her, especially the back and forth between her and Vice President Biden around the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But I think that she held her own. I think that she was steady. And I think that what voters like to see from her is that level of consistency, that she is clear, that she is focused, and that her message hasn't changed. That seems to be what's resonating with voters. That seems to be what other candidates are worried about. And we'll see how that comes out in the poll numbers here after this last debate.
So let me ask you both, because obviously you both watched it, and it's obviously so many people did. We said that there seemed to be, quite a lot of substance. The 12 on stage, and it's a very big number. It wasn't so much a total constant game of gotcha and sound bites and who's going to get viral and this and that. There was substance, and actually, by and large, and I think you both pointed out, there was respect amongst the candidates on the stage last night.
Except one moment, Christiane, which you mentioned at the start and Brittany's referred to as well, which was the exchange over the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, which Warren helped create. There was a bizarre moment towards the end where Joe Biden started shouting and jabbing his finger at her, saying, "I got you the votes for that bureau," which, by the way, isn't true. Chris Dodd and Barney Frank, who were behind that legislation, say Biden wasn't the prime mover in that fight. And then when she said, I thank President Obama and didn't thank Joe Biden, he then said, "You did a great job," very patronizingly to the senator to his left. And she kind of stopped, paused, and said, "Thank you." And I just think to myself, how can you get away with stuff like that in 2019? Joe Biden, I wonder how his team watched these debates and talked to him afterwards, because he keeps making these gaffes. Last night, he confused Iraq with Syria and then with Afghanistan. He said he wanted to abolish capital gains tax before realizing what he meant to say was he wanted to raise capital gains tax. He is a candidate who was the front runner. I hope he now isn't the front runner. I hope Warren keeps that title, or at least Sanders does. And between Warren and Sanders, there's actually a meaningful debate about what progressives do next. We see Pete Buttigieg swinging hard because he sees that Biden's on the ropes and he can take that mantle of being the moderate, non-Warren, non-Sanders candidate.
Before I get you to weigh in, Brittany, I just want to play this exchange in question. Let me just play it and then we'll talk more about it.
I went on the floor and got you votes. I got votes for that bill. I convinced people to vote for it. So let's get those things straight, too.
Senator Warren, do you want to respond?
I am deeply grateful to President Obama, who fought so hard to make sure that agency was passed into law. And I am deeply grateful to every single person who fought for it, and who helped pass it into law. But understand—
You did a hell of a job of your job.
Thank you.
Well, anyway, we've sort of discussed it. You certainly with you, Mehdi. I guess what did you make of that, Brittany, in terms of the substance of the evening?
You know, I'm really thinking a lot about what Senator Booker said when he stood up, frankly, as the adult in the room, even before that moment, and said, we need to make sure that though we may disagree, we do so in a way that allows us to move forward together. Because we saw, as Democrats, what happened when we didn't do that in previous years. As has already been stated, there are a lot of people on that stage, and I believe that voters are really looking for two things. One, they are looking for the herd to be thinned. 12 is far too many. It is more than we had in the previous debate. People were not looking to move up from 10. They were looking to move down from 10. And most certainly, we're still looking to see 5 or 4 candidates on that stage so that there can be more time for real substance and for us to figure out the real differences between the candidates. I think the other thing that voters are looking for is for the candidates to be leaders in deciding on how the party will conduct itself. We cannot have a split decision that leads to people being unable to be unified in defeating Donald Trump. What I was seriously frustrated by was the fact that in all of the substance that we heard, and we finally also heard about reproductive health care, which was so important, we didn't hear anything about voting rights. And all of the policy discussions are really for naught if the Democratic Party does not take seriously the challenge that we have seen digitally and in real life to the power of the vote. We have seen people of color, poor people, elderly people be disenfranchised over and over and over again. We saw it specifically in 2016 in states like Florida and Georgia. We see folks like Tom Steyer with enough personal wealth to fully fund Stacey Abrams' fair fight in Georgia, but deciding instead to be a candidate on that stage. How can he and others actually make a different decision and move the country forward in ensuring that everyone has the right to the ballot box? We know that our election has been tampered with digitally. And if the Democratic Party is serious about taking back the White House in 2020, they have to be just as serious about protecting the franchise.
Well, it's really interesting, of course, that and vital. And of course, the African-American vote is going to be one of the most important votes. So to that end, Brittany, I wonder, can you reflect on the fact that despite two major, two prominent African-American candidates in Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, it is Biden that has the majority of the African-American vote, according to the most recent Quinnipiac poll. 50% of their vote for Biden. Warren at 18, Harris 7, Sanders 5, Booker no. I mean, no. Look at that. There's not even a register there for him. What does that mean, and what does it mean for the turnout and for the enfranchisement of this very important demographic, obviously?
You know, we often remind the general public that Black people are not a monolith. And so the fact that we have such a diverse cadre of candidates right now means that it's given people more choices than they've ever had before. And that is both significant in how it can move us forward in the future, but it also means that Black voters, Black people, have different choices and more choices to make. When we look beyond just kind of those initial poll numbers, though, we see, again, that Black people are not a monolith. We see young Black voters moving differently than older Black voters. We see millennial and Gen Z Black women having a lot of affection for people like Elizabeth Warren, people like Bernie Sanders. That is a different conversation than the conversation that is happening perhaps with some Black baby boomers who are Team Joe Biden, right? So there's a nuanced conversation happening in the Black community, and we consistently recognize that this is a conversation about policy that will affect Black people and not just who is standing behind the podium declaring that policy. So we want to make sure that we've got someone that we can trust. We want to make sure that we've got someone who says one thing and doesn't do another, but actually means what they say and says what they mean. We want to make sure that somebody will follow through and consistently listen to Black people when they give feedback, when they push their policy and their agenda, and when we make sure that candidates are being responsive to all areas of our community. We also have to recognize that there are many folks in even more marginalized spaces among the Black community, Black college students who are dealing with debt, Black LGBTQ folks who are dealing with intersectional oppressions. We want to make sure that all of those conversations are at the table. And I think that Black people are being very wise right now. Black voters are being very wise in ensuring that we're not giving away our vote and simply handing it over to the most familiar person or a Black person or anyone who people might assume would be the choice that we would make. We're
Right.
taking our time and making a nuanced decision.